How do I talk about this? I've been trying to approach these games as objectively as possible, but even compared to Super Metroid, I've played through Fusion a ridiculous number of times. I'm just gonna say this up front. While Metroid 2 is my new favorite of the 2D entries, this is probably, objectively, the best 2D Metroid entry in the quadrilogy, despite its shaky reputation. And I do want to touch on that briefly. I was never really among those that didn't like this game. My introduction to the series was with Prime, followed by Fusion and Zero Mission, so I didn't have an overt attachment to the supposedly non-linear design of Super Metroid. I wasn't exactly blown out of the water by Fusion either, but I certainly had a good time with it. I'm honestly not sure where all the vitriol towards it came from, or if it's still around, or perhaps even why it's still around. I can only assume it's because there were fewer exploits by which you could sequence break like in Super Metroid. Which, well, fair enough I guess, but that doesn't really make the game non-linear. You're just deviating from the intended path via means the developers hadn't really thought about. To be fair, people have been kinder towards Fusion as of late, though I think that's more to do with Other M not being very good rather than any kind of revelation over the quality. Well, I'm sure I've pissed off enough of you already with my dissing of Super Metroid. There'll probably be a touch more of it, but I do like Super. It's definitely a great entry, so take my gripes with a grain of salt, I suppose. You think I got them off my back? Well, let's get started. Same as last time, we'll start with the title screen. I know some of you are probably starting to get weirded out by my talk of title screens. That isn't exactly a common topic when critiquing, or even reviewing games. But it's important to remember that a game can grab your attention with a strong detract mode screen or title screen, and of the 2D Metroid quadrilogy, Super Metroid and Fusion are easily the strongest. Fusion's attract mode starts with a large green vessel traveling across the screen with BSL written on it, followed by Samus's gunship, which after several seconds veers off into an asteroid field and explodes. Like, holy shit, what the hell was that? Did Samus just die? That would probably be an understandable line of thought for those seeing this the first time, I can imagine. If they had no prior exposure to the game, that is. I don't generally like to touch on the media lying outside of the game itself, including box art, but I can imagine that the drastic redesign of Samus on the box art would have had players questioning the possibility of Samus dying at the beginning. The effect wouldn't last long, obviously, after you've started the game, but it's enough of a hook to pique your interest, if nothing else. Metroid Fusion is also a decent title as well. At this point, those familiar with the series almost certainly know what a Metroid is, so the only question remaining is, what's the Metroid fusing with? Is it related to the possibility of that new character on the cover? Did a Metroid fuse with Samus? Is that what that is? Well, let's dive in and find out. So, much like Super, this game begins with the setup for its plot, going over the events that transpired beforehand. Unlike Super, however, this setup doesn't retread old ground. Well, not much anyway. If you'll recall, in the last video, I said that Super could have been just as effective in its storytelling without the exposition dump at the beginning. And that's not the case with Fusion. Fusion's plot hinges on the understanding of the events that transpired beforehand. Now, some consider the narrative focus a negative, but I personally find it to be one of the most enthralling narratives in the Metroid series. The plot can best be summed up as Samus is sent to planet SR-388 to escort researchers for the Galactic Federation in gathering specimens. During her travels, Samus gets infected with a mysterious parasite known only as X, which overtakes her central nervous system, resulting in the crash from the earlier scene in the title, which Samus survives thanks to her ship's auto-eject. After large segments of her power armor are surgically removed due to the X infecting the armor's biological components, Samus remains in critical condition, only being saved thanks to a vaccine created from Metroid cell culture the Federation managed to obtain before the events of Super Metroid. This changes Samus's biology drastically, along with the missing armor components. This makes for a Samus that is far more physically frail with a newfound weakness to cold, but also more agile. A trade-off I actually like, but we'll get to that later. Shortly after recovering, there is an explosion at the BSL station where Samus's suit components were sent to, and Samus is sent to investigate. With her gunship having been destroyed, she borrows a Federation vessel with the condition that she follows the orders of the ship's onboard AI. Now, that's technically where the intro ends, but there are a few things I want to cover that are mentioned as part of the story beyond that. So I will. Shortly thereafter, Samus finds that an explosion from the specimen storage caused an outbreak of X parasites within the station, resulting in the death of all crew members. It's discovered that the X are capable of mimicking the appearance and abilities of anything they infect, and by reconstructing a clone of Samus, known only as the SA-X, they freed themselves from containment by using a power bomb. There's plenty more expository storytelling I could cover, but for the sake of time, and so you can experience the story for yourselves, I'll leave it at that for now. It's really good. Definitely worth playing through. I normally wouldn't go this in-depth with a game's story outside of visual storytelling, but Fusion is such a vast deviation from the storytelling approach of the last 3 games that I felt it necessary to talk about. That, and it has a pretty complex setup that does require some explanation for the sake of the environmental storytelling and gameplay mechanics I'll be talking about as we proceed. I know that was unusual, so I thought I'd clear that up. Now, as I mentioned previously, this game gets a lot of flack for being more linear than Super Metroid. And while I can understand why, I think there's a lot that many players overlook that might have motivated the design decision. Something that I notice often gets overlooked by other people who've covered this game as well. And I can't really blame them. It's handled rather brilliantly, and the effect is so subtle I nearly miss it myself. Let's start with the obvious stuff. There are a few factors often attributed to the game's linearity, most common of which is the ship AI, which orders Samus around. More perceptive critics attribute it to the level design being more linear, and honestly, both assessments are correct. But I think to write it off as that is really underselling what the game does. From a narrative perspective, it's easy to look at the ship AI as the main, if not only, narrative contributor to the linearity, and that's where I've got to spell out a big fat no. The prominence of the ship AI's role in this game's linearity is, to put it bluntly, overstated. Apart from stopping the player to relay orders, the only thing the AI actually does is set objective markers and provide you with a small map of your current area. This map doesn't include maintenance areas or areas which the researchers wouldn't typically access. The map design feels like it was designed for actual people, save for the odd floating platforms. But that's an unavoidable convention of the genre in this format, so that's understandable. I mention this because many times you'll find your way forward has been cut off, leaving you to search for alternate ways to your destination. The game is still linear, but it remembers to create the illusion of choice. Super Metroid does this as well, actually. The only thing it does differently is that it removes the interruptions. But there's a reason I'm not knocking Metroid Fusion for these interruptions. There are 3 competing intelligences at work in the narrative of Metroid Fusion, 2 of which are often overlooked. We already touched on the ship AI, assuming you didn't have a memory lapse, so that just leaves the X and the player, or Samus. Now, when I say the X, I'm not referring strictly to the SA-X, though it is their primary trump card against Samus. Throughout the game, many of your destinations are located on the other sides of security latches. You discover pretty early on that these latches are the only thing preventing the X from spreading throughout the entire station. So, for the first 2 latches, their release is a calculated risk made by Samus and the ship AI to attempt to stop the X permanently. This puts the X in this interesting position of both viewing Samus as a threat and a means by which they can spread. Usually, as a result of the SA-X or other large creatures destroying the environment, you'll often find yourself in a position where your exit routes have been cut off, making undoing security latches your only way out. A large part of this game's linearity is a result of the ever-changing environment of the BSL station. It's easy to think of the station as a static, unchanging location, since it's possible that it being a space station may subconsciously make you think of a more sterile environment in contrast with the more natural environments of Zebes and SR-388. But this is actually the first 2D Metroid entry where the world changes as you progress. The most pronounced example is the power outage at the midpoint of the game, where you discover that the station's reactor core is being choked by plants overgrowing from Sector 1, where the X is manipulating the plant life of the area in an attempt to impede Samus' attempts to thwart their spread. Lesser examples, of course, being the environmental destruction caused by the SA-X, or a more subtle example is the Zeros, the larval version of the Key Hunters, which wander around Sector 2, and become platforms when they begin to metamorphosize. It's little touches like these that make me enjoy the game so much in the first place. Additionally, both the ship AI via the Galactic Federation and the X act as Samus's means of obtaining power-ups. The Federation equips Samus for her tasks by sending her downloadable upgrades to data rooms across the station, though once their interests change, what upgrades are sent are either redirected to reduce the odds of Samus finding them, or ceasing to send the upgrades altogether. X play a similar role in regards to Samus upgrades. After realizing the data rooms are strengthening Samus's arsenal, the X actively cut off your routes to them. They even destroy data rooms themselves, or download them biologically to use them against Samus. Samus herself is also capable of obtaining latent abilities by absorbing special X variants that lie within boss monsters, and they always make sense. See Arachnus with the Morph Ball, or Ceres with the Speed Booster. Every obtainable ability from an X corresponds to the creature they've infected. It creates this crazy battle of power between the Federation, the X, and Samus, where Samus has to overcome the indirect sabotage of the Federation in her mission, and the active interference from the X as they grow more and more aware of the threat you pose. I think it's fair to say the odds have never been so stacked up against Samus in a Metroid game since Metroid 2. That all sounded pretty pretentious, right? Good. We've been going on a while, and I haven't even talked about the gameplay and level design, so I guess now's as good a time as any. And I'll be blunt, this is by far the best control scheme the 2D Metroid series has seen thus far. The physics are damn near perfect, precision platforming is actually reliable unlike previous entries thanks in large part to how much heavier Samus feels. Perhaps counterintuitively to the last comment, Samus also feels more agile, thanks in part to the screen crunch and her newfound ability to grab ledges. The controls have been simplified drastically as well since Super. Super missiles and the new ice missiles now stack like beam upgrades, and the Morph Ball jump has been combined with the high jump upgrade. Diagonal aiming controls have been collapsed into a single button, and activation of missile fire and power bombs has been moved to the shoulder buttons rather than the more awkward select button of the previous entries. Just about every conceivable problem I had with the gameplay of Super has been fixed, and it's just brilliant. Once again, I won't be talking about the bosses and combat much here since that'll be in the next video, but suffice it to say they're really good for the most part, especially compared to their Super Metroid counterparts. Level design has been made a lot tighter, in that there is actually good level design now, rather than just good world design. I touched on it earlier, but a lot of the charm with the level design in this game is a result of how the environment evolves as you progress further into the game, and this wouldn't be possible if the game didn't make good use of the level geography and texture work hinting at alternate paths and secrets, which, if you'll recall, was a point of contention I had with Super. Is the game fairly linear? Sure. If open-ended exploration was sacrificed for the purposes of actually good level design, then I'd say it was worth it. This isn't me mocking non-linearity either. There's certainly a place for it, and as I've mentioned before, the interconnected world design is actually quite good in Super, even if the level design suffered because of it. But there are plenty of other 2D Metroidvania-style games that have handled the balance of world design and level design far better. If a game comes down to choosing between good level design or good world design, I'll pick good level design every time. It certainly doesn't help Super's case that the gameplay for Fusion is better in practically every regard as well. Am I forgetting anything? Oh, right, the texture work and sprite animations are easily the best in the series as well. The music is an excellent combination of both ambient pieces and mood-setting pieces, the latter of which are largely attached to conversations with the ship AI to convey the tone of the situation, and it's just handled really well. I guess this is where I would provide my closing thoughts on the series. The reason behind this series of videos is so I could look at how gameplay and design philosophy changed over time, and the gameplay and level design standard that would eventually be set by Metroid Fusion. I honestly knew going into all these that Fusion would have the strongest gameplay of the four, but I was curious how replaying the series with a more critical eye would change my perspective. Metroid 1 ended up still being a barely enjoyable slog that I couldn't be bothered to complete. Metroid 2 hit me out of left field with an experience the series has yet to replicate, which, despite its gameplay faults and hardware limitations, managed to deliver one of the most engaging and dread-inducing experiences I've played this side of Silent Hill. Super is still good. I really like it, and I'll probably continue to replay it in the future. It definitely deserves the praise it gets, but it's a deeply flawed entry in the series when compared to Fusion and most of the other entries that came afterwards. And Fusion, it's just excellent. Is it the best in the series? Well, objectively speaking, yes. But in terms of overall experience, I'd say that Metroid 2, Super, and Fusion all capitalize on different aspects of the raw potential that was present in Metroid 1. Metroid 2 takes the atmosphere and enhances it with its masterful sense of visual storytelling and world building. Super refines the original game into a masterpiece that is renowned for bringing the Metroidvania genre to new heights, and Metroid Fusion polishes the gameplay and level design set in Metroid 2 and combines them with an interesting narrative. So basically what I'm getting at is 3 out of 4 ain't bad. If you've not had the chance to check any of these out, I definitely recommend playing Metroid 2, Super Metroid, or Metroid Fusion. You honestly can't go wrong with any of them. I hope you all enjoyed this series. I certainly hope I was able to bring something new to the table. Now, there is going to be one more video after this to close off the series where I'll be examining the evolution of Metroid combat design, so stick around for that if it sounds at all interesting to you. If you're wondering why I'm ending the video series here and not diving into Zero Mission, AM2R, or Samus Returns, it's basically a matter of equipment. While I could cover Zero Mission and AM2R, I'd rather structure them as part of another quadrilogy consisting of Zero Mission, Other M, AM2R, and Samus Returns, since they all adapt the 2D formula set by Fusion in different ways. And for those questioning why Other M is on that list, it's because the design sensibilities have more in common with the 2D games than the 3D entries. Unfortunately, it could take anywhere from a year to another half-century before I'll actually be able to get around to making any of those, for all I know. If you're interested in seeing that series come sooner, consider contributing to my Patreon. That's probably the best way to go about doing it. If I'm able to meet the $500 milestone, I'll be able to get the 3DS capture hardware necessary for covering Samus Returns, amongst other games. Something I'd really like to do personally, since the 3DS has been my favorite gaming platform for the last 5 years or so. And I'd like to share some of my love for those games as well. If not, don't fret, I've got plenty of content on the way to follow up this series. I've got some Monster Hunter stuff planned, maybe some Pika-Mans, and who knows what else. At any rate, I'm really excited to have gotten this channel started, and I hope you all enjoy watching my videos as much as I enjoy making them. And with that, I hope you all have a fantastic night and that this video lit a fire under ya. I ain't stopping the catchphrase. No one can stop me.